Go ahead, Sharon.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our special session, Teaching the Pre-Modern as Mediterranean, featuring the brand new textbook from the University of California Press, The Sea in the Middle and Texts from the Middle. My name is Sharon Kinoshita, and I am the co-founder and co-director of the Mediterranean Seminar. And so I'm pleased to welcome you here today. This is part of a Mediterranean seminar workshop on the Mediterranean and the origins of the modern West. So the textbook, while aimed at an undergraduate audience, really draws on the kinds of research and conversations that people who are here with us today in the room at the University of Colorado Boulder and a wide circle of collaborators have been having for many years now, in ways that we think are generating fruitful new questions that are not only perhaps truer to some of the materials about the pre-modern era that we've been mulling over for a long time, but especially relevant for teaching in the classroom today in the 21st century. So let me turn things over to Sergio.
Hello, I'm Sergio Porta. I am a professor of Armenian studies at Fresno State. And let me just say, I really look forward to reading this book. It's terrific. And I think the way it's going to work is that Tom and Brian are going to introduce the book. They're going to introduce themselves and they're going to introduce the book. And then Sharon and I will start asking them questions about it. And then we'll tell you all to buy it. I think that's the way it goes. Tom?
So hello, my name is Thomas Burman, and I'm one of the three co-authors of The Sea in the Middle and one of the three co-editors of Text from the Middle. I'm a professor of history at the University of Notre Dame and the director of the Medieval Institute at Notre Dame. And I want to say just a few things in my allotted time about what we were aiming to do in writing the textbook, or at least open up one window in, I guess, our thought processes as we conceived of the book and as we actually wrote it and went over it together. And I would say in some ways, all three of us were formed first, but not only as Western medievalists, and our interest in the Middle Ages began in one form or another with the European Middle Ages, and mine began as some others of you in this audience and those of you at home, perhaps with Sydney Painter and Brian Tierney's textbook on medieval Europe, which was a very fine textbook in many ways, and it hooked me on the Middle Ages as an undergraduate. I actually used it early on in teaching. But I was always puzzled by certain things in that textbook and in that particular view of the Middle Ages, which was a view that focused mostly on Britain, France, and Germany, and a little bit of Northern Italy, Spain every once in a while, and the Crusades. That was sort of the Middle Ages, with this arm out to the Crusades from the later 11th century to the end of the 13th century. And I remember vividly as an undergraduate being in a course on the Middle Ages using that textbook, and the instructor got to the point of talking about the sort of philosophical and scientific revitalization of Europe. And I was introduced for the first time to this amazing thing of the transference of Greek philosophy first to Arabs who hungered for it deeply and went out of their way to acquire it, and then through medieval Spain mostly by Latin scholars who were very thirsty for new knowledge and new ways to approach it, and went out of their way to acquire it from the Islamic world. And that was like 3 sentences in the textbook. And I remember thinking, this is a gigantic story, But it's as if it's something that has been off stage so far in this textbook, and at this particular moment, it's brought from off stage onto stage, and we see it for 3 sentences, and then it goes off stage again. And I think in a lot of ways, as we worked through thinking about the book and writing it, we were very conscious of trying to bring things that had been more or less off stage and made a cameo appearance in the narrative. We wanted to bring those right into the center of the narrative of the Middle Ages. So I've used examples from cultural history and scientific history here, but we could say the same thing about many things. Flipping that over, we might say, as Brian is often fond of pointing out, that the Crusades weren't this unique event in the Mediterranean. This arm of European civilization suddenly striking out across the Mediterranean to establish the Crusader states, but were part of a big pattern of other peoples from the hinterlands of the Mediterranean entering into the Mediterranean and becoming powerful sultans, and the Franks happened to become sultans at the eastern end of the Mediterranean for a period. So we wanted to bring things that had been off stage to the center, and I think we wanted to explain their whole history, or at least much more of it, so that we could really understand, students would be able to really understand that this process that led to the scientific and philosophical and medical flourishing of Europe in the High Middle Ages was really part of a long history of Hellenism and very sophisticated Arab reflection on, not just as the mailman who passes through the Greek knowledge to the Latin world, but highly sophisticated reflection on and building upon that legacy before it ever got to the Latin West. And the Latin West, of course, relied heavily on that Islamic further elaboration as it understood the Greek past. For me, it might be summed up well by thinking about not so much science, but technology. And I'll say a few things here about the astrolabe, which I think we say in the textbook is the Middle Ages cell phone. It's this amazing tool that does all kinds of different things and is multimodal and compact all at once. But even in the language we use, the terminology of the astrolabe has the whole Mediterranean written right across it. We call it an astrolabe from Greek words, astron and labein. Don't. My Greek pronunciation is terrible, but the term itself comes from Greek. But some of the terminology of the parts come from Arabic. In the Latin world, they called the sight on the back of the astrolabe through which you can figure out the elevation above horizon of a star or a planet. They called it an alidade, and that's from the Arabic word adudiya, meaning ruler. So there are other aspects of the astrolabe that the terminology of the Arab world stuck to it, but then other parts of it, as it was used in the Latin world in the High Middle Ages, are just plain old Latin words. A tympanum for that background, a drum, and a rete for the spider-like map of the heavens that rotates around it. So right on that instrument, the astrolabe, the cell phone of the Middle Ages, we can see the whole Mediterranean written out in very clear form. And so rather than having the astrolabe appear in Western Europe because Chaucer wrote a treatise about it for his son Lewis, we wanted to tell the whole story of the astrolabe, this thing that had been introduced from off stage and brought to the center, but we wanted to tell the whole story of it as well. And from my point of view and thinking back on the process over the last 7 or 8 years of writing this book, I think that was at least one really important sort of practical set of goals that we had in writing this book. And with that, I will stop and will welcome any questions later on.
Okay, everyone. My name is Brian Catlos. I'm another one of the authors of the book. I'm a professor of religious studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. And before I begin, I should say that you'll notice if you've seen the book that there are 3 authors and there are only 2 of us here today. And this is because our third collaborator, Mark Meyerson, was not able to join us, but he's here in spirit and we hope to represent him as well. I won't really say much about my journey to the Mediterranean. I want to talk a little bit about the book, but I'll say a little bit about it. My entree is a little bit different from Tom's. I'm more of a social historian. My interest is ethno-religious identity and communal relations. And, back when I was a grad student in the late Cro-Magnon period, we were presented with a world that was very much divided between the Islamic world and Christendom, 2 very different, incompatible civilizational units as they were. And one of the ways in which they were supposedly different was that Islam was tolerant and Christianity was intolerant. Well, when I was a graduate student, I started studying 2 things. One was Mudéjares, which is subject Muslims in the Crown of Aragon in the 12th and 13th century. And at the same time, I was looking at Coptic Christians in Fatimid Egypt in the 12th century. And I expected to find the Christians partying all the time in Egypt and the Mudéjars in Spain living this miserable existence. But what I found was, in fact, that their experiences were not that different, really. And so what that indicated to me was that, the civilizational aspect of their experience was not determinative. In fact, you could control for it as it were. And if you could control for religious doctrine and remove it from the equation that leads to their social, economic, and personal experiences, then it must be something else. And this brought me towards the Mediterranean and the sorts of social and economic structures that emerge, as Horton and Purcell have shown quite eloquently, out of the geography and the longue durée history of the Mediterranean as what informed these relationships and what gave shape to these institutions, particularly maybe not as they were idealized, but as they were demonstrated pragmatically and in practice. So that was my kind of trip to the Mediterranean. And once, I had gotten to that step, basically, the blue pill was swallowed or Pandora's box was opened, or there was essentially no going back. And I found that, I wasn't the only one who was bothered by or, uncomfortable with the sort of paradigms that had developed in order to analyze the Middle Ages. And so here we are today at the 33rd workshop of the Mediterranean Seminar, a room full of people, all of whom in some way or another are looking to interrogate these categories because they're dissatisfied with them. So one thing that's missing is, there's a lot of us want to teach the medieval Mediterranean, but it's really darn hard and quite daunting because you have to deal with all of these different linguistic and religious traditions. And so we thought, Mark, Tom, and I, what was missing, or one of the things that's missing, is a tool to do it, something to give to instructors and students to be able to feel that they can manage this incredibly complex history with some confidence and give them a framework to work with. So, this is what we came up with. The Sea in the Middle, which is our textbook, and Text from the Middle, which is the source anthology that goes through it, goes with it. And I just want to run through very quickly some of the features for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it. First of all, one thing that might stand out to you is the chronology. It's a little bit different from the standard chronology of the Middle Ages, right? We go from 650 to 1650. And you can see where the major divisions are, 1050 and 1350. And we can talk more about that later if anyone has any questions. I don't want to dwell on it too long, but you might just meditate on as to why that's maybe more suitable for framing the Middle Ages, particularly a Mediterranean Middle Ages, than say the dates we're used to, something like 1492. Okay, so just to give you a little idea, we didn't write, it's not quite a linear history. The textbook progresses chronologically, but also engages thematically. And if you look down the subheadings of our chapters, you'll probably find that some things that you might expect to be there as separate subheadings, like the Crusades, as Tom pointed out, are not there. Okay, they're there, but we don't approach them in the way, that traditional historical narratives have done. For some obvious reasons. So just to give you an idea, these are some of the sort of subheadings that our book runs through. I wanted to bring your attention to the maps as well. I was at a talk at UCLA last week, and Ryan Speech gave this excellent talk. And one of the aspects of it was the sort of tyranny of territorial thought. And I just want to point out, as I did to him, that if you look at the maps that we created for this book, you see a couple things that are missing that you would expect on maps, right? No lines, no arrows. And that's quite deliberate, because as soon as you draw lines and arrows on a map, you're making arbitrary decisions as to what is happening where and where these boundaries are. And for us, that's really a symptom of the greater problem of the way that, these histories have often been looked at. The other thing I wanted to point out is that, again, the press was extremely generous with us. So the book, the main textbook, has no less than 120 color illustrations. And we feel this is really important because these are not just pictures, but we really try to integrate the visual stuff into the sort of the teaching that goes on through the book. So these aren't merely decorations, but they're really integrated into the text and connect with the major themes that we're looking at. But perhaps the most innovative part of the textbook, I think, and this was inspired, there was a little mini genre that popped up a few years ago, World History Through 100 Objects, right? And they're fun, these things. And we thought this would be a nice way to get at some of the themes that we want to look at. So what we did was, in the textbook, we've integrated these things we call artifacts. And unlike most textbooks where you get the text of the chapter and then you get the documents at the end that the students just pretend to read, we put these at the front of each part of each chapter so that students start with something that they can get their hands on to explore the major themes. And I just want to give you a couple examples to see what we think of artifacts. Sometimes they're textual. So for example, comparing the Pact of Omer with the Treaty of Tudmir. I won't go into what those are if you don't know them. And we give bits of text, and there are study questions or discussion questions and some further reading questions so that these can be used to build student essays, right? Sometimes they're cities, evolution of a city, a building, objects or textual objects, again, urban landscapes, a variety of different sorts of objects, of technological innovations that we think really reflect the sorts of dynamics that we want to discuss. So I'm almost done with this. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the reader too, the source reader that goes with it. Each chapter in the book has 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 sometimes, what we might call documents, but that's a little bit deceptive because they're not actual documents. What they usually are is a little tranche of documents. Okay, so for example, if we go to one of Tom's, I think this is Tom's chapter, Learning Medicine, Finding Medicines, within chapter 9, you'll see that the reader gives you a little short introduction, right? And then what we have is we have not one lengthy source extract, but in this case, 3 or 4 small but representative chunks of the source material. We find it's sometimes, on the students today, it's a bit of a burden to ask them to read lengthy source extracts. So instead, we wanted to cut right to the chase and give them small excerpts that really summed up these sources. And then you could use them to engage in kind of comparative discussions. So getting at the themes, but also kind of integrating these different historical viewpoints, genres, etc. And again, with some study questions or some discussion questions and a little bit of additional bibliography in case students want to build an essay out of one of these reading units. So again, just to kind of sum up what the book is all about, we really think that it has 2 kind of applications, and one is that the textbook and the source book can form a sort of a package to teach a sort of 10-week to 15-week survey of medieval history, or pre-modern history, more properly speaking. But also another way that I've used the book is when one teaches a topical seminar, sometimes one finds that, because we have fewer and fewer grad students for one thing, right? The grad students in your seminar might not just have the historical background for the period that you want to work with. And so last year I did this in a seminar I taught, and basically for the first 3 weeks, we just went through the textbook. And that kind of put us all on the same page contextually. And then we could dive into the thematic things that we wanted to discuss in the seminar. So those are really the kind of highlights. I've outlined on the UC blog, there's a post called Teaching the Medieval as Mediterranean, where I've outlined how I use the textbook in case that's helpful for anyone that wants to try it. And if we have time at the end of this discussion, we're working on a community website, a sort of wiki for instructors who are using the book. But more about that later, perhaps. I'll give the microphone back to our moderators and let it rip.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Tom. I guess I'm following up on that. I did want to start with a very pragmatic and practical approach to the book, because I find the book incredibly readable, but I am familiar with the background, and I can imagine it may be a bit overwhelming for undergraduates who may not have had the same prior exposure, whether of graduate students or of professors. So I was wondering if you've used the textbook yet in class with undergraduates, and then how did it function in that setting? So I know you just touched upon that, but I wonder if you can expand upon how it actually worked in.
Yeah, I can certainly answer that question. I taught the course, a course based on the 2 books last semester, and I was kind of concerned too that first of all it would be a lot of stuff for them. Mm-hmm. And second of all, and I think this is a kind of a generational thing. We all grew up with this kind of Eurocentric canon that we're now, busily trying to dismantle. But our students don't have that baggage, so they're not coming from there. So we don't have to, teach the canon and then unteach it. What I found is that the students are coming remarkably free of preconceptions. And, the scholarly world has changed so much in the last 40 years. It's much more diverse in terms of who, professors and students are, but particularly students. And students live now more than ever in a world of ambiguous identities, which is what this Mediterranean is all about. So I found that intuitively they got it. So when I was talking about this messy world of Christians, Muslims, and Jews doing all these things they shouldn't have, they totally understood it. For them, it didn't seem weird at all, because that's kind of the world that they live in, where the sort of the formal divisions that once kind of seemed to structure society are now really seen as arbitrary, malleable, ambiguous, and porous. So, going from the student evaluations, I'd have to say that it absolutely was not an issue.
Okay, I'm sorry, Tom, do you have teaching experiences to relate?
Yes, just briefly. I haven't used the whole textbook. I'm using a couple of chapters of it in a freshman seminar this semester. And it's a seminar in which they're reading all kinds of things, scholarly journal articles, primary sources, as I said, a couple of chapters from this textbook. I've had pushback on some things that I've assigned them, where they said, this was just way too geeky, way too many names, way too much to sort of wade through to get at it. They didn't say that about the textbook. But it's hard to know, of course. Are they just being nice to me because I'm one of the authors? Students, but I have a sense that it is accessible, at least from the little bit I've been using it.
Okay, thank you. One thing I was wondering, to the extent that all 3 of the co-authors, to the extent that they're regionally bound, have done really textured work on Iberia. Excuse me. So the question that occurred to me is, what do you think it might be about your experience as Iberian historians in, very different areas that might have provided the initial insights that drew you to the Mediterranean, that got you to think in the ways that were leading to this textbook. But then also conversely, what were the challenges or the particular perspectival method and methodological, I don't want to say obstacles, but challenges you may have come across in putting the textbook together?
Well, I'll say a few words about that. We dedicate both volumes to Jan Hilgarth, distinguished professor at the University of Toronto, where we all studied, who died a few years ago and was a very important scholar of one of the leading scholars of medieval Spanish history. But he was also, I think, what Remy Constable would have described as a restless Mediterraneanist as well. He wrote a book about Aragon as a Mediterranean empire. He was very adamant with students that it was, if they wanted to study medieval Spain, it was a really, really good idea to learn Arabic, even though he never had himself. And I think his example and his stress that we should move beyond the traditional Latin and Romance sources of Spanish history really put us on some rail lines that moved us to the Mediterranean. And I think the experience that Mark just talked about, that once we started to look at the broader Mediterranean, we started to realize, wow, the eastern end of the Mediterranean and the western end have so much in common. In the first kind of scholarly work I did on the Mozarabs in Spain, I was struck by how useful it was to look at the Arab Christians of the Middle East and read the scholarship on them as a way of understanding what's going on with the Arabic-speaking Christians in Spain. So that, I think it wasn't any accident. It was very intentional that we dedicated it to Hilgarth because I think he put us on those rails. I think the biggest challenge for me and maybe for all of us is that we had all had a fair amount of training in Arabic and Islamic studies. Where we had the biggest gap was in Byzantium and in the Ottoman world. And I think we all had to work really hard to get to some kind of level of competency to be able to talk about that. That was the obstacle I was most conscious of having to try to overcome, was just here's this whole remarkable civilization that I didn't really know all that much about and had to try to master.
If I would follow up on that, I'd say that, we were all, because most people think of Tom, Mark, and I as primarily people that work on the Iberian Peninsula. I think we were really sensitive that people would be reading the book and wondering if we had overprivileged the Iberian Peninsula. So we worked really hard to present a picture of the Mediterranean that didn't do that. And hopefully we'll be successful. You guys will be the judge. But in any case, the point is the textbook is a starting point. So, as you use it, if you use it to teach, you can explore whatever it is your particular speciality, and you can use it as a foundation. So in terms of Sharon's question as to, what coming from medieval Spain, how that kind of affected the way we think about the Mediterranean and the book. Well, people used to think of Spain as the land of three religions, as something unique, right? And obviously one of the things that you learn in Mediterranean studies is that Spain is not, or the Iberian Peninsula is not unique in that respect at all. In fact, it's typical of the Mediterranean. What really sets the Iberian Peninsula apart is the abundance and diversity of source material that you have. Okay, so it allows you to develop a picture of over quite a long durée of society, culture, politics, the economy, which is far richer and more detailed than certainly the textual sources for a lot of other regions let you, right? And so two things come out of that. One is that to a certain extent, by applying the sorts of model based on the dynamics that you can observe in Spain can give you suggestions about what's happening in other places, although one has to be careful when one does that. But another kind of way out of that trap is also to take an interdisciplinary approach where you incorporate, things like architecture, material culture, literary studies, et cetera, to help sort of balance that out. So I would say the pitfall, and I hope we escaped it because we were very conscious of it, is not to project, to make our Mediterranean a projection of the Iberian Peninsula. And, I hope we didn't do that, but those of you who use the book, who work on other periods and places, will be able to judge that for yourselves. And, once we get this community website up too, you'll be able to give that feedback that we'll all be able to share. So the idea is that the project, keeps evolving and improving as we go forward.
Okay, great. All right, enough of the softballs. Okay, so I did want to push back on something that I noticed in the book, that it often seems to privilege empires and nativist discourses. So for example, the barbarians, I mean, you put them in quotes too, who were first recruited as mercenaries for imperial armies, are described as having infiltrated the imperial administration as though they had no legitimacy to be there, even if it's several decades after they came into the imperial orbit. Or, quote, Byzantium spiraled into a disarray encouraged by Slavic and Armenian elements in the army and palace, right? So this continues Verona's reductivist narrative that it was the influx and rise of these non-Hellenistic elements that brought about the end of the empire, when they had been there like almost from the beginning of the empire. And so their influx doesn't really change anything. Many of the Byzantine emperors, of course, had been of Armenian descent or partially Slavic prior to the fall. And it seems to give this easy sort of nod to, why do empires fall? All because foreigners bring them down. Now, sometimes that's true when it's an army that actually destroys another army. But the sort of internal workings of the empire seem, I mean, what you actually seem to point to is that there is, and maybe it could be rephrased this way, a heightening of the discourse of foreignness within the empire itself. And we're mistaken, though, to see that as the actual cause of the decline. But something as a decline is happening is exacerbated. But I don't know if you guys wanted to respond to that.
That sounds good to me. Yeah, at bottom, it's really hard we're all prisoners of language. Essentially. And the real challenge, I think, in writing any kind of historical narrative, particularly one that you're trying to make while preserving its complexity as less complex as possible so that it's digestible by, students, one consciously or not, the way one expresses oneself sometimes frames things that way. But I think this is exactly it. What we're not talking about is the sort of infiltration in a physical sense, but the way that internal struggles are articulated or perceived of, right? And certainly, I think we can track periods when, for example, and this is as true of any of the other polities that we study. When they go from what is apparently, a sort of period of dynastic stability to one of instability and competition. And, the way that is articulated in the text of the time is not necessarily the way we would articulate it today. So it's a difficult balancing act. And I'm sure we didn't always succeed, but, the book is not meant to stand on its own. It's meant to be taught by instructors who can bring out those nuances.
To the next.
Okay, let me put on my hat as a specialist in literature. And in some previous textbooks on European history or the history of medieval Europe,
I eagerly looked through the table of contents and demoralized but not necessarily surprised to find that literature, art history, etc., are either absent or kind of squeezed in some sort of appendix. So even though this is the product of a collaboration among 3 historians,
I'm gratified to see the extent to which the three of you have worked in what we might call more cultural artifacts, not ghettoized in some final chapter, but for example, you have sections on reading each other's books in, I think, across the three time periods in ways that weave then the cultural texts into the larger narratives that you're developing, but also in ways that cross confessional boundaries, linguistic boundaries, all of the kinds of proto-nationalist siloing that's also common in presentations of the Middle Ages. So, yay. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that developed organically in your discussions of the planning of the textbook.
Well, to be honest, we read your articles and those of other and books of other fine literary scholars. I think we did probably a better job with literature than we did with art history. We tried to work in art history and the artifacts, but I don't think we were as systematic about it. The particularly ways that you have thought about literature fit really well with how we wanted to talk about cross-cultural interaction and in the intellectual and cultural sphere, because we have, first of all of these stories that travel all the way across the Mediterranean and show up in nearly every language, such as the story of Barlam and Josaphat, which begins in India, and we have a couple of Arabic versions of it. We have a Hebrew version of it. We have versions in every single European language, including Old Norse, where there is a Barlam saga. It was in a way hard not to use that material, given the way we'd structured the book. So, like I say, a lot of thanks goes out to you and other literary scholars who've explored these things with such sophistication, and that we were happy to learn from and put right in the book. We could have done a lot more along this line. It was, in some ways, I was thinking about this recently. The table of contents that Brian showed you in the PowerPoint was pretty much the table of contents that we came up with in one of our very first meetings, that one in Toronto. And it's interesting to me that it didn't change all that much over the course of time. There were some tweaks here and there in the table of contents, but those elements were present from an early period, and they were filled out. I think to include more, which I would have liked to have done, would have meant rethinking some of the chapters to do so. So I don't have much more to say about it than that, but just to thank the great literary scholars out there that we learned from.
Yeah, very much a book standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing.
Precisely.
Tom's pretty cool. Okay, the book is a remarkable piece of work that brings together. I mean, working in collaborative projects, these are really difficult to do, and you guys have done an amazing job. And the conceit of the book, of course, is the Mediterranean, and the title, The Sea in the Middle. And I kept writing in the margin, middle of what? Because even if you look at the cover, in order to make it the middle, the picture had to be cropped, right? The world had to be cropped in that way. And someone coming from the other side of this middle, where the Armenian and Iranian world, where the Mediterranean isn't in the middle, but it's sort of on the Western periphery, right? From a Eurasian perspective, it's no longer really in the middle in that way. Having said that, obviously you can't write all the books, but maybe you can. But as you said when you're teaching medieval history, right? I mean, that's a slippage there between that, as though all of medieval history happens within this like cropped picture. But I think this is a great place to start. It's an amazing place to start. And so I'd like you guys to discuss how you think this book can transcend its own, what I call self-defined metacentrism, All right, yeah, there you go. Yeah. In order to broker that broader conversation, right? Because I know, and it's not like you guys, I know you very well informed on Iran and you're very aware of the fact that that's there. How do you see how this book can do that? Help, cause about the demise of your own subject by deconstructing the Mediterranean with a book that's about the Mediterranean?
Well, let me say, Sergio, this is the last time we ask you to moderate a panel. First of all, there's an old saying that says, wherever you go, there you are. So, where is the center? Well, first of all, let's not Platonize the center, right? For us, I think, I don't want to speak, too much for Mark and Tom, but for me, what places the Mediterranean, what makes the Mediterranean the sea in the middle in this period is, if part of what this book is looking at, the origins of what in the broadest sense we call modernity, which is why people study the kind of Middle Ages, right? Then for me, what puts the Mediterranean at the middle is that it seemed to be, for much of this period, not entirely, it kind of fades in and fades out, the dynamic epicenter of innovation and of contact and the sort of dialectic processes out of which modernity emerges, right, seem to be kind of, to a large extent, taking place in this area. Now, our Mediterranean, is not bordered by the sea kind of thing, in the sense it's a Mediterranean of relationships. And therefore, what the Mediterranean is changes depending on what you're studying, okay? We're not drawing new lines, right? Remember, the maps have no lines because it's all about relationships. So in some things, the sort of center within this larger Mediterranean world, which is really a way of saying the West, okay? And for us, or at least for me, the West is not Europe. The West is, if we have to draw boundaries, right? And to a certain extent, we kind of do, as long as we don't take them too seriously, that West stretches from somewhere around the Indus to the Atlantic, right? And it kind of, over the centuries, it extends itself north and south, down through the Sahel, into Central Africa, north up to the Baltic, because for me, what defines this period, 650 to 1650, are two things. One is the cultural hegemony and domination of Abrahamic faith, which I think we can see in some ways as a single cultural entity, right? And the other thing is that we were talking about earlier today in this meeting is the organization of society along confessional lines, right? And that is something that emanates out of this larger Mediterranean. So this is not to say it's the center of everything, right? Or necessarily that, it has to be the center of the Cruz map. You could argue that even though it's on the left-hand panel of the Cruz map, it's still, in the important senses, it's the center, right? Because it's the only navigable part of the map, right? Or possibly navigable part, right? The eastern stuff is all just hearsay filled in. That's where the goodies are that are coming back to the Mediterranean. So it may be on the left-hand side, but that doesn't mean it's not the center unless you're determined to view the map in pedestrian terms, right? Which I'm sure you're not, Sergio. So.
I prefer walking to sail.
So that's what I've got.
I'll just say maybe one thing which is that as we talked about the book and wrote the book, we very rarely talked about how big the Mediterranean is and what it includes. It sort of organically developed that, as Brian said, relationships that were really important and connected deeply to the Mediterranean wound up being in the textbook. So I don't think you can write about the medieval Mediterranean without talking about Ibn Sina, who spent most of his life 2,000 kilometers from the Mediterranean. you really can't talk about it because Ibn Sina is the most important single philosopher for the Mediterranean, as Peter Adamson has argued, and so, which is as much as to say that we were very pragmatic about it. We wrote about the relationships that there was scholarly work available to us to put into this set of narratives. We wrote about the relationships that really drew out the connectivity of the Mediterranean. And we didn't bother much with thinking about how far north, how far south, how far east the Mediterranean went. And then furthermore, we were always pragmatic about this. We never wanted to reify the Mediterranean as the end of history somehow, that once we have figured out Mediterranean history, there's no more history that has to be written. And there are no more frameworks that can be usefully applied to the pre-modern world. And I think in a lot of ways, we saw the step toward writing a Mediterranean textbook as the next logical step. I think Karen mentioned this earlier. I don't know that we're quite ready as a scholarly community to really write about the global Middle Ages in a whole way, but I think the scholarship surrounding the Mediterranean after the last 40 or 50 years is enough that we could coherently write about it. But who knows, in the next 40 or 50 years, we might be in a position where the really exciting frame is going to be a global one instead of a Mediterranean one.
And I would just add, I hate the term Mediterraneanist. Like, why do people have to put people in boxes, right? We're not tearing down the idol of Eurocentrism to like construct, a new golden calf of the Mediterranean. That's not the idea. This isn't to suggest that Europe-centered or Central Asian-centered or African-centered perspectives aren't any less valid as historical perspectives. What we're looking at is a set of questions. And for that set of questions, in many ways, the Mediterranean provides what we think is a better, more logical and historically sound framework or perspective than Europe or the Middle East or Africa for those questions. But that doesn't mean that those other perspectives are not equally valuable when applied to other questions, or even valuable when applied to the same questions. So don't presume that we're foreclosing anything. The aim of our project is not to foreclose, it's to open.
Okay, so addressing what might be the elephant in the room, one elephant in this crowded room. When many people hear the word Mediterranean or Mediterranean history, they think Brodel. And so the association with Brodel comes with environmental determinism and is kind of, to caricaturize it, set in opposition to human agency or a history of great individuals and so on and so forth. So as you were doing your montage of photos or images in the book, Brian, I saw, for example, you have a nice 2-page spread on the Kanat and the Notre, so kind of irrigation systems, which are very pertinent for those of us in California or you in Colorado today. But I wonder if you could talk about the ways in which you might have thought about explicitly or maybe implicitly finding that sweet spot or bringing together and showing that these different approaches to the Mediterranean are not as polarizing as maybe they've sometimes been portrayed.
Yeah, thanks, Sharon. That's a really interesting question. None of us clearly would be called environmental determinists, but I think we were very conscious of trying to tell the story of the Mediterranean that did include its environment and did include some of the ways the environment both shaped human experience, but also contributed to the direction of technological development. So the Kanat and Noria, both of which are inventions of the Persian world, migrate across the Mediterranean through these zones that are quite dry and where there isn't much rainfall, and to do farming effectively, it makes sense to adapt this ultimately Persian set of inventions for medieval Spain and for North Africa. So I don't think there are very many places that you could point to in the textbook where we began with the environment and moved out from there in any way, in the way a true environmental historian would. But I think we consciously thought a lot about the way the environment fit into the narrative. And I think, you know, a number of parts of the book attest to that. So did a really good job. Do you want to say anything about that, Brian?
No, I think you covered it. Yeah, I mean, determinism, again, that's sort of a loaded way of looking at it, right? The notion that if one takes into account the environment, all of a sudden one is privileging that as a sort of primary historical cause. You know, but not to include it is absurd, you know, I think. And clearly there were certain things that were going on in the Mediterranean that arose out of its environment. And I think, you know, I'm much more with Horton and Purcell than say what seems to be a much more kind of, you know, charmingly simplistic, you know, Braudelian view of it. Because, you know, what they talk about is really the importance of the geographic structures and conditions that led to connectivity, right? Which is, you know, one of these great words, and which kind of actuated the potential of the Mediterranean when these places were connected. Like you go to an island like Malta, right? So Malta, what is there on Malta? There's snails and rabbits, right? There's like 3 trees, snails and rabbits, right? Yet Malta has these Neolithic temples that are immense, right? So what does that tell you? That tells you that since the Neolithic, okay, people have been moving around this area and developing strategies for the accumulation, storage, and redistribution of resources, okay? And you don't see that in other places, okay? Connectivity is what engenders, right, the dynamic of innovation, which drives, well, I don't want to say progress because it's teleological, but that, you know, drives change, you might say, to a large extent. And a lot of that arises out of these physical characteristics of the Mediterranean. Okay, that doesn't mean it's it or it determines it, but it's certainly a condition that contributes to what is happening historically, and to ignore it is, I think, a big mistake. So.
Okay, I have a question about strategies of writing, and as is befitting a history, you have the book divided into 3 chronological segments, and as you point out, they're not necessarily the same chronological segments as you would expect from a textbook more centrally focused on Europe. But I did want to ask you a question because, for example, in part 3, which covers the centuries between, you know, circa 1350 to 1650, you begin the preface and the first chapter in that whole section in 1610, which is quite close to the end of your period. So what, I'd like to think I'm flexible and that histories don't need to be chronological, but I just was curious what went into that decision to approach that material in that manner.
Well, that was Mark. Next question. Yeah.
I assume I don't have the book in front of me, but a lot of this has to do with we were always searching for really good vignettes with which to start, and so often the vignette doesn't. For example, in the chapter on mystical messiahs, converts, humanists, and armorers, we have a vignette that is Pico de la Mirandola, who's well into that period, but he exemplifies the kinds of things we were trying to capture in that chapter particularly well. And, the same is true of an earlier chapter that we begin with Sadia Gaon, who's in the first part. And he again is much later in the period that the first part covers. We were looking for really good stories for those sections, and good stories trumped chronology.
And I would just add regarding the chronology, none of us would describe ourselves as environmental historians, I don't think. And when we came up with the sort of the chronology, we looked at the development of the caliphal imperial world right after the rise of Islam. And then when that collapsed, or 1050-ish, right? And then obviously the Black Death and the crisis of the 14th century, and then 1650, and even our beginning point, 650. And we kind of realized, postscript afterwards, that these map on to these profound environmental events. Right, there was the collapse, the environmental collapse of the mid-6th century, right, which kind of provides the vacuum into which the Islamic world kind of flows in, right? And then another period like that starting around 950, right, in the Eastern Mediterranean, which coincides with the beginning of the so-called medieval optimum in Northern Europe, and then the collapse of that in 1350 with the exhaustion and the end of the medieval optimum and the beginning of the Little Ice Age. So we found quite unintentionally that the political and social and economic stuff that we were looking at, lo and behold, it matched up with these environmental things. So it was kind of a reaffirming realization, and it all does kind of fit.
Yeah, that was interesting, because actually I saw it and went like, oh, this is like the same way I periodize Armenian history, or in those exact, obviously there's a period before 650, but it's part one is to 650, then it's to about 1000 to 1050, then to 1350 in the Mongols, and then whatever comes afterwards, they don't really care. But we get through it in the last few weeks. But but yeah, so it was I really enjoyed seeing that periodization.
Okay, we'd like to open up the discussion to questions and comments from our audience, both present and virtual. So let me start with a question from our online participant, Amy Singer, who asked early on, how did you approach the multiplicity of languages and associated terms? Do you include the terms in original languages with transliteration and translation? What was your strategy?
Yeah, I think we tried to achieve a little bit of a moderate success here. There was no way to sort of bring the linguistic material entirely to the surface. We didn't want to, for example, use full Arabic transliteration, because I think we're right about this. This makes undergraduates really irritable to see dots and long signs that they don't understand. And so we used a simplified Arabic transliteration system that we also use for the other Semitic languages, basically. We did try, though, to make sure we were representing names and terms from other languages in the recognized system that they're spelled in the modern scholarly world. So when we dealt with Byzantium, we didn't use US endings. For people like Photius, we used the OS ending. We tried to keep as much as we could to representing the linguistic complexity as fully as we could without driving undergraduates crazy. I think that was our basic principle.
But this is the challenge with the Mediterranean, right? Because identities were many people had a multiplicity of identities. So even when you look at a particular historical character, are you going to use their Armenian name or their Byzantine name, or the same person might have an Arabic name? So, there's no winning formula. So we tried to do our best to kind of, decolonize our vocabulary as much as we could. And, you can judge for yourself whether or not we were successful.
Constantina?
Yes, it seems to me that actually, I haven't read the book, but it seems to me that it's more of proposing an intellectual program that Mediterranean, in this sense, is to see history in the world in a certain way, right? So in this sense, it's like inviting other people doing work in other areas, doing similar things somehow with their own stuff, and it has been done already. So, but to follow up on that question, one question I have is whether you are planning to promote this book to be translated into various Mediterranean languages. Since, we have this question, like, we talk about the Mediterranean, but we don't have these things in order to be able to teach them in the Mediterranean. One is this, and the second, are you planning to have a sequel on the modern Mediterranean? Because I really want that book.
Okay. Answer the second question first, which is easier. No.
Repeat the question.
The question was, the question I just answered no to was whether we were planning a sequel for the modern Mediterranean. No, but anyone else is welcome to do it. We don't own the topic, so go to town. And the first question was, remind me what the first question was? Translating. Yeah, that would really be, I think, for us, and there is already some interest for us, that would be the ultimate vindication, I think. Because textbooks by their nature are national centric, right? And if this narrative that we've constructed resonates with, say, people who are teaching in France or Italy or Morocco or Turkey or Greece, to the extent that they can translate this and they would feel that this is a narrative which presents this history in a way that doesn't conflict, say, with their sort of own kind of regional or national perspective, that would be mission accomplished for us. Because if we're trying to get away from this sort of privileging, then, which is inevitable, we're all subjective kind of thing, but that would be great. And we're working on it. So hopefully, yes. And if you have any connections, we'll be happy to to exploit them.
Okay, Samia Arazuki online asks, you said that you wanted to show that the Mediterranean is not the end of history. So how does the Atlantic world figure into this book, precisely when you think about the ways that practices of the Atlantic slave trade emanated from the Mediterranean, something Gordon and Purcell briefly touch on?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, this is a book about the Mediterranean, and as our kind of Mediterranean world sort of, I would say, as its protagonism fades, part of that protagonism, that fading, is because this West that we've looked at since 650 becomes integrated into a much larger world. So, there are things you could say about the Atlantic world. There are things you could say about, its engagement with Asia. You could talk about colonialism, and all of those things start happening, but that's not really what our book's about. I mean, I guess I would have to say. So you can look back and you can probably find, for certainly something like the slave trade, you can see in our book, part of the origins of that and antecedents of it, but we are not drawing a line from modern phenomenon back to the Middle Ages. That's up to the reader and the teacher to do. What we're providing is a sort of base, and you can go with it where you want to. So if you want to use this as a setup for an Atlantic history, by all means, you're welcome. And you're probably going to emphasize some things more that we emphasize less.
Karen?
So first of all, thank you for doing this and for showing that there's other ways to read interaction with customer and reading. I have a couple of questions related to my particular concern. One is, why not include, perhaps you're revising information, why not include Islamic historian and Armenian historian two medieval European historians and one Jewish historian covering the gamut. I think, I'm just saying, you get a different perspective, right? I mean, I would wonder why, there's not more of a range of critical scholars involved. Maybe it's difficult to get scholars involved, and maybe I just don't know the other side of it. The other question I have, of course, is related to maps. So, A, I could ask you how you picture maps, or B, I could tell you that I'm really bothered by this section. In particular, Conrad Miller's version of the Mediterranean in the 19th century construct. For the Islamic side, that's the only map we have, and it's very problematic. I could actually give you the one I developed for the MESA I wrote for baby, where I invented a very drop in Conrad Miller. But why not choose other Islamic?
Maybe we can pause there and let them reply.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it would have made sense to have. It could easily make sense to have a whole entirely different authorship for this book, and to have it be more balanced. As we have made clear, we all are originally Iberianists, but we all do have extensive background in Islamic and Arab studies as well. Part of it is the demands of collaboration. It was important that we three knew each other, had known each other a long time, found that we could actually collaborate in a useful way. And, at some point, the problem becomes what can you put in place to finish a book? And part of it was putting in place three authors with enough breadth that we could carry this through in some kind of decent way. And I think that's how the authorship wound up being what it is. But we would certainly consider other co-authors if, inshallah, there is a future edition.
I'm not sure. I mean, this isn't Noah's Ark. You know what I mean? And I don't understand the question, quite frankly.
Should we repeat it for the people online? They didn't.
The question was, why didn't we have an Armenian historian or a Muslim historian, or why not? Yeah, but why? Who's the Islamic? Why not have should it be a Maghrebi historian, or should it be an Arab, or should it be an? I don't understand the question. What we're doing is we're presenting a history. We're working with data and we're analyzing it. We're presenting it. I don't understand why our identity, if we have done this successfully, is even an issue. I just absolutely don't understand the question.
When you deal with the expert from one of the other areas, they bring certain details and depth in work and understanding people. So I'm just saying.
Well, if anyone can demonstrate what is missing and what would be adequately addressed by that, then that's something I think we should consider. But absent that, in sort of vague terms, we could have a collaboration with 500 authors, right? But would it create a book? I don't think so. So.
Okay, moving from the
Maps. What about maps?
Well, we do what we can.
moving from the macro to the methodological to the practical, Josie Henderson asks, what course level are the books designed for? And if both are assigned together, how much reading are you envisioning per week?
The course level we imagine is perhaps an introductory, but also an intermediate history course. I think mostly we thought of it as an intermediate sort of second or third year history kind of class. And that's the audience we were trying to connect with. But as Brian says, it can be used usefully with graduate students. I've done that myself. So we wouldn't want to, make it to be too exclusive to just that range. If you assign a chapter of each a week, it would be about 35 to 40 pages of reading total, because there's about 25 pages in each chapter, and probably in the accompanying reader, there's 10, 15 pages of material.
Yeah, so about 40 pages a week. As I said, when I taught it to a class of undergraduates who ranged from freshmen to seniors. And, you know, it was certainly a challenging class, but as far as I could tell, no one felt like they were in over their heads. So our aim was probably, you know, as Tom was saying, as an introductory course, I think it might be a challenging first year, you know, maybe a second year. I'm not sure really, but you know, these sorts of these sorts of qualifications are pretty vague anyways, you know. So, but I would say that you could assign it as an undergraduate survey with confidence. That's my answer. I think you answered it.
Anna Kosowska asks, what about slavery and race? How do you teach these aspects of the Mediterranean? Do you emphasize them at all?
Well, there's a whole chapter on slavery in the book, in the third part of the book. Oh, the question, oh, you already gave the question, didn't you? Thank you. So we take the issue of slavery, and that chapter also does a lot of work with what we might think of as race making that's going on in the later Middle Ages, especially in North Africa and Iberia, where we have the introduction of African American slaves and the first experience that people in these regions have of Africans is as slaves, and this contributes in very key ways to the sense that Africans are by nature a people that should be enslaved. So that's much of that is addressed in that chapter, but I think in various ways throughout, and Brian can probably say more, we try to address those issues as well.
Well, this was one of the challenges of the book. There are themes that stretch through the entire period. You could write a book on gender in the Mediterranean. You could write a book on religious observation. You could write a book on slavery. And for us, really, what we had to juggle was following all of these strands and threads as best we could over the course of the period and weaving them into the history without privileging them, any one of them, any more than any other of the strands. And I would say that was probably the greatest challenge. And what really helped us out was, for example, the reader and the artifacts, because if we look at gender, right, obviously the way that history has been written is highly masculine centric, right? But obviously women were an important part of this history. So the artifacts and the reader was one of the opportunities that we had to bring those themes in without necessarily bringing them to center stage or making them the center of the book. But that was really, really challenging, you know, whether it was, I wouldn't say just race, but ethnicity and ethnic identity and race, slavery, gender, and so on and so forth.
Questions from the floor? Yeah.
Stop the question and not the comment, but we that's on what Sergio and Sharon were saying, but I would like to reverse it. I'm really struck by how much the title resonated with me, The Sea in the Middle. And I was wondering if you could actually add consciously how much you thought about it, if it was a decision that came with some thinking, because of what I see in that is maybe century of, and I'll come back to it in my paper, of the Mediterranean as a subject of history, which has since the 17th century excluded many others. And in that sense, I see that it represents something of the openness of this discussion to something more than the Mediterranean, but a sea in the middle as a gesture. And what I wanted to say in this discussion is that in a way, I even see this as part of, you know, the attempt of Eurocentrism to become more Mediterranean. And so if it is a white vote for white folks, that's perfectly fine. The sense of it is also that it participates in a discourse that creates a counteraction to certain Eurocentric identity ideas that are extremely dangerous and extremely strong at this historical moment. So I see it as part of the
Okay, and we're just to remind you, we're being asked to recapitulate the question for the people online.
So the question was, where did we get the title? To cut it short.
Yes.
Mediterranean means sea in the middle. Basically, right? So.
But do you want to talk about it? Talk about it in relationship to Eurocentrism and decentering. I mean, it's implicit in a lot of what's been said, but maybe it bears reiteration or reformulation.
I guess I would say we like the title. I think it resonated with us. It resonated with us in ways that I think we were not entirely conscious of, but we thought it captures something. I think for me, what it captures is precisely dynamism. Because if you put the sea in the middle of the title, what it does is it emphasizes connectivity, it emphasizes the rapidity of travel, the rapidity of trade, all of these things that are in many ways at the heart of this tremendously dynamic complexus of different civilizations that are borrowing and interacting and drawing walls between each other. And so I've always liked it because it really brought that dynamism to the foreground.
And seriously, it resonates with, this is what Isidore said when Isidore of Seville describes what the Mediterranean is. The sea in the middle, right? So.
I mean, I like the way it also deterritorializes the whole subject, so you're not worrying about the borders or the boundaries. But more of the sort of the spaces between which stuff happens.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, I have a question about the, I guess where the previous mentioned is about the language that you use. I mean, so Brian, I've experienced it using Brian as a scholar and then as a trade publication, like vulgarization of history. How do you situate the writing in this? That comes here. Like, how do we situate the register? And how did you decide on that?
Okay, the question is about the register of language.
Because it's hard to situate a very complicated subject in terms that are more conceptually and linguistically accessible.
The question is about the register of language for scholars used to writing scholarly articles, sometimes crossover general audience articles, but what is the specificity of a textbook for undergraduate audiences?
Well, I think Mark and I, who had not written for a trade, any kind of trade publication, learned a lot from Brian about this. But I think another part of that, and a very, very important part of it, was that it's true that each of us wrote first drafts of some of the chapters, but we actually sat down with each other over a series of meetings that went on for several years and actually read out loud every chapter and, you know, talked about it line by line. Is this something that an undergraduate would find accessible? So that practice is really, I think, the most important decision we made that led to what we hope is accessibility. And we found, and I know Mark and I both talked about this, that the voice we wanted to use is the voice we would use in an undergraduate lecture. And the same kinds of gestures, the same kind of level of explanation. Once we figured that out, at least for Mark and myself, that was when we could write then without including way too much stuff. And so I think that practice was really really key.
And for me, my strategy is to write as if I were speaking to intelligent people who don't have background in the subject. Right? So minimize the jargon and try to present what you're discussing in a way that someone who's a layperson but is interested would be able to get the important points.
Okay, I think that exhausts the question queue.
And I think we're at time.
So, and we're about at time. So I want to thank all of you, both present and online, for participating in this. And I'm sure the authors encourage you to request an exam copy of the book from the University of California Press, and also to be on the lookout for the online website and to, participate and interact, ask your questions, propose your supplemental materials, chat with each other. So thank you very much for attending.
My follow-on question